Suzi Hall. This is a really exciting event, and I can't wait to hear from these wonderful speakers we have to talk about this book. The Migrant's Paradox is about migrant city making, how the street in British cities is the site for a particular kind of world making by people who have crossed borders and who experience what Suzi calls a citizenship of the edge. The Migrant's Paradox itself stems, and this is no spoiler because this is the first sentence of the book, stems from the fact that a migrant is a person required and refuted by Western sovereignty, as Suzi writes. And this simultaneous requirement and refutation frames a story that takes in so much in this book. It is analyzing migration, identity, urbanism, sovereignty, borders, liberalism, repression, xenophobia, resistance, high streets, shop design, everyday cosmopolitanism, and so much else. The book moves back and forth between discussions of a huge number of social and political theorists, people like Stuart Hall, Arundhati Roy, and Edouard Glissant, to shopkeepers, observers, and inhabitants of places like Rookery Road, Birmingham, Stapleton Road in Bristol, and Peckham Rye in London. Through an analysis of the micro practices of city making and the micro records of inhabitation, Suzi gives us a picture of the struggles and solidarities of urban migrant life in contemporary Britain. She explores how border crossing people learn to be unsettled. And in the process, she helps us unsettle some of the fundamental categories through which we think the state, the city, and citizenship. So I just want to very briefly quote the wonderful blurb supplied for this book by Abdul Malik Simone, who writes that Suzanne Hall is our Alvin Ailey of urbanism. And this book is an intricate and fiery choreography of the street. And I think this is a great way to describe her ethnographic and theoretical method. So in a moment, I'm going to give the floor over to Suzi, who's going to walk us through some of this choreography and explain some of the book's arguments and contributions. And after hearing from Suzi, we will in turn hear from our esteemed panel, Professors Gargi Bhattacharya, Ajmal Hussein, and Engin Isin, and we'll hear from them in that order. After that, Suzi will briefly respond, and then we'll open the floor up to questions. As you can hopefully see in the chat, if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. So that way we can see your questions. As well, the department is saying that if you want to tweet about this event, if you have thoughts or questions or commentary, you can also tweet about this using the hashtag LSE Sociology. So without further ado, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Suzanne Hall. Suzi is an associate professor at LSE, where she's also deputy head of the sociology department. Suzi was trained both as an architect and as a sociologist, and her work explores the intersections and asymmetries of global migration and urban marginalization. She is also the author of City, Street, and Citizen, The Measure of the Ordinary, which appeared in 2012. And she's co-editor of the Sage Handbook of the 21st Century City. The book that we're celebrating tonight, The Migrant's Paradox, has just been published by the University of Minnesota Press, and I urge all of you to read it because it's wonderful. So now I'm going to pass the mic to Suzi, and we can let this event begin. So thanks again for coming, and over to you, Suzi.
So my thanks to all of you for joining us tonight, and my warmest welcome to friends and family who've joined us in cyberspace, some of whom have come in all the way from South Africa, and to my amazing colleagues and students who are dotted in nearby rooms down the corridor. I'm so pleased that you are proximate. Thanks also to Amy Gordon and Laura Kemp, and of course to David for getting this show on the road, and to the amazing Gargi, Ajmal, and Engin for being part of this conversation tonight. So the research I'm going to talk about happens because research participants have the grace to share their stories with us. And it also happens through collaboration, which is still a central part of academic life that belongs to us. And I'd like to thank Nicholas Palominos, Adriana Valdez-Young, Sadiq Tofa, Julia King, Robin Finley, and of course, Ajmal Hussein for being core to this collaboration. Okay, so my book brings the border and the street together to ask what it means to make a working life in places that are under-resourced and over-bordered. From streets in the de-industrialized peripheries of Birmingham, Bristol, Leicester, Manchester, and London, I explore how the asymmetries of global migration map onto durable inequalities of urban marginalization. Because the street is a lively realm, because it is social, frictional, planned, improvised, policed, and defiant, because people on these streets live and breathe the impacts of everyday border controls, cuts to their public resources, job losses, rising rentals, as combined and not separate, my book addresses how the UK migration system is integral to overlapping systems of displacement that unfold across imperial, national, and urban space. Bringing the border and the street together allows us to understand the interplay of nationalism and neoliberalism in the maintenance of hierarchy and inequality, but also, and crucially, to specify how a racial order is centrally deployed in the organization of dispossession. So between 2012 and 2017, our interdisciplinary research team spoke with hundreds of shop proprietors, the majority of whom were migrants working in Rookery Road, Stapleton Road, Narborough Road, Cheetham Hill, and Rye Lane in Peckham. Over this period, we could see the unfolding of the 2008 financial crisis, where local authorities were losing half of their budgets or even more through austerity measures. We're seeing the large fallout of immense work redundancies that were particularly evident in the public sectors of these cities. And we were seeing rising rentals as global capital was seeking out urban property for financialization. So we could see at the same time the punitive effects of the 2014 and 2016 Immigration Acts that decentralized border control into the circuits of everyday life, while introducing more layers of bureaucratic procedure, more privatization of control, and less layers of judicial review. And as if all of that wasn't enough, we could see the anti-immigration electioneering that always accompanies general election cycles in the UK across the political spectrum, where increasingly inequality is made the sideshow of migrant scapegoating. So in talking with shop proprietors, it became acutely apparent to us how their space was constricted by these intersecting displacements that were diminishing their citizenship, supplanting their secure work, and eroding their affordable space. And I just want to highlight a few threads from the street. So firstly, the proprietors' migrant journeys collectively spanned 4 decades. This gave us insights into a wide variety of movements over time, accompanied by an equally wide array of political relations that shape migration systems. These included invitations by the British government to Commonwealth citizens in order to secure labour for the then urban industrial project. They included relations to empire and colonisation. They included processes of asylum, many of which were connected to places of British political interventionism, and they included the movement of EU citizens, with a distinctive increase evident after the 2008 crisis. So from this array of people, space, and time, we learn that migration is not an episodic process that accumulates as a crisis outside of the nation and at a national border. Instead, migration systems reflect an assemblage of instrumental political intentions around influence, around territory and labour, and it is these extractive systems, invariably tied to policy, that significantly shape movement. Secondly, the majority of these proprietors were never traders in the first instance. They had become street traders by virtue of discriminatory migration and labour systems. So the streets in my book contravene the story of the mom and pop corner store where children go on to become professionals. Rather, these streets reflect the systemic process where accreditations are not recognised and where racialized and minoritized groups are the first in line to be made redundant, following substantial shifts to the labor market, most notably in these cases after the de-industrialization in the 90s and after 2008. Also importantly, many of these proprietors had had to contend with multiple border regimes over extended time periods of their adult life whilst en route to the UK. They expended their energies in acquiring more accreditations, learning more languages and upskilling, only to be caught in an extended cycle of being rendered perpetually redundant. So the street is therefore shaped by intersecting systems of displacement and is simultaneously a vital resource to forge livelihoods behind, below, and beyond the strictures of whiteness. It convenes a multitude of improvisational repertoires that incorporate profit and profiteering, care and counsel, and importantly, circumvention and transgression. From the streets, we see how border logics based on hierarchy and hostility are never limited to the exterior regulation of a prefigurative racialized outsider. Discriminatory border logics always map onto internal configurations of social sorting. So then as we stand back from the street and we look towards the unfolding abuse of European and UK border regimes, it is not only that race and racism is used to designate constitutive outsider, but it is the basis on which extreme forms of violence and death are apparently condoned. In this quagmire of cruelty, caught between the hierarchical and contradictory articulations of Western democracy and liberalism, it's absolutely crucial that we learn about borders and about citizenship not solely and essentially from the state. And so a central question of my book is what we learn about borders and citizenship from the street. While systemic inequality and its racial orders prevail, we learn about an understanding of being together that supersedes the nation's preemptive claims on belonging. From the street in the urban peripheries comes the idea of a citizenship of the edge, and this is about the complex ways in which people cross borders, individually and collectively, while dealing with the precarity of everyday life. And from this vantage point, we learn about the spatial, the lingual, the physical, the associational repertoires of crossings, recognizing that border crossing is both mundane and transformational. So in this sense, citizenship is neither conferred nor individual. Rather, it is claimed and it is social. From the street in the edge territories, we learn that a migrant is a person engaging in encounters with uncertainty by finely attuning the practices of how to be unsettled. And the last thing I really want to say before I hand over is to say that the people who are at the center of my book are migrants, and a core responsibility in using this term is to reclaim its pre-colonial and its planetary meanings. From our histories and our everyday practices, migration is understood as a cross-border process that is vital for life to respond to ambient and unexpected change. Always and ongoing practices of cross-border circulation, transition, exchange, and refuge are our shared heritage and our interdependent future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. There's a lot there, and I'm sure that everyone's interested in hearing more about all of this. So now I'm very excited to turn to our panel to respond to this book and to pose some questions to Suzi. And first, I have the honor of introducing Professor Gargi Bhattacharya, who is Professor of Sociology at the University of East London. a major British intellectual who has written about race and racism, sexualities, global culture, the war on terror, and racial capitalism. Professor Bhattacharya has written a huge number of books and articles, including Traffic, the Illicit Movement of People and Things, and Rethinking Racial Capitalism, Questions of Reproduction and Survival. And she is also a co-author of the recently published brilliant Dream Team authored book, Empire's Endgame, Racism in the British State, which appeared this year and which is powerful. So Gargi, please unmute yourself. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I was going to say neither major nor British nor an intellectual, but otherwise all of it is accurate. But thank you. And I guess also partly just to say what, for people who haven't yet read it, what an astonishing book Suzi's book is, and both kind of, you know, as Abdul Malik has said, kind of theoretically choreographed in a way as if you watch the twirls, but also really, you know, especially for people like me who've lived around some of those places, so evocative of like just what a certain construction of British space, which is still now almost never given an attentive eye, is like, and where it fits within the broader understandings of the economy or the social space. So if you haven't read it, do read it. And thank you for writing it, really. I guess I don't really have a presentation. It's not that kind of event. I've got a few things I wanted to say. One of them, Suzi has actually already said about the use of the word migrant. I was also involved in a project relatively recently about border crossing, and we chose very much not to replicate the legalistic categorization of who you become as you cross the border. I have to say, having to fight hard because we had an external polling company work with us as well, and there's a kind of push always as if, well, what kind of movement are you? Are you an asylum seeker? Are you a irregular? Are you? And I kind of think there is a political point to refusing the replication of that sorting and categorization, which I kind of hear in the last things that Suzi was saying. And I'd like to just highlight that again for what that means for how we speak to each other. There are reasons, I understand, of course, I'm not a refugee studies person, and there are reasons, and if you do legal scholarship on borders, you need to know, you know, speak in those terms. But there is something, I think, in how we are all disciplined to act as if there are people in the world who have these legalistic labels on them. And from those legalistic labels, our whole encounter with them and social research analysis of them, and even where in the bookshelf and the library and the conference program they fit is kind of given. So I think some of the ethnographic push of the street rather than the status, and the street as a space remade by bordering, helps us to rethink that. I kind of just hope other people will try and do it some more, because there's such a push in this country to always say, oh, but when people mean migrants, who do they mean? Who do they really hate? Rather than, okay, what's going on with that movement? Really, the questions I have, well, they're not quite, they're questions for all of us about the moment of the book and then what has happened to us all since then. I think I've almost never read a book which so seriously takes the question of how bordering remakes the British economy and its everyday textures, and as Suzi has already said, is so co-constitutive of how both not only the national space, we hear lots about bordering as if it's just imaginative, isn't it? That, oh, you have bordering so that people can think there's foreigners over there, so you can have your national identity over here. But this is a much more textured and lived way of thinking of, well, it isn't only about what's in your head, it's about how people are dispersed, it's about how economic activity is then dispersed through that serial dispossession, and what that does to the spaces that we live and work and shop in. And that's really essential, because you can't understand what's happening in certainly any British city, and I suspect any British town, unless you kind of grasp some of that dynamic. You can't get it. Why is it that if you want a kebab or a taxi anywhere in the country, you know who's going to offer you that. You know, there's something that needs to be understood there. But then, of course, for all of us now, what the centre did to constitute itself has so rapidly and violently been remade through the pandemic. So I have a kind of set of just like, I guess, kind of queries to myself about, well, how do we take that thinking into this space now? Because the whole idea of the edge economy and the edge population infers a kind of centeredness of someone somewhere. And those relationships have changed so drastically in the last 2 years that in terms of bordering and the ways that bordering make urban space, there's been such a variegated shift across the world. Certainly a stopping of move, not absolute stopping of movement, but a different set of stoppings of movement than we had before. A going homes for lots of people as the kind of halfway shadow economies of the kinds of streets that Suzi is talking of just collapse. A whole question mark about what it means to be a street trader. I know that, you know, Rookery Road and Narborough Road are not street trading in the ways that we might think of street trading in the great cities of the global south, but there is a kind of inside outside of those minoritized spaces, which I don't know, it's not really an argument, it's sensibility. I think that it's just not the same, that, you know, the barrier between the inside and outside the shopping space, where trade begins and ends, seems to me somewhat different in many minoritized spaces, and that's all been kind of ripped up. Even just really mundane stuff. A lot of the kind of tact that is traded in the minoritized neighborhood has not been readily available in the last 2 years. It's kind of, firstly, the market has not been readily available because the people who work in those neighborhoods or pass through them have been at home doing their online Tesco delivery. And also the stuff that was sold previously there has had a different circulation, which is then that's been more intensified the problems with that supply chain more recently, but it was already happening all through the pandemic, I think. And all of that makes me think, both the edge street and the centre that it's meant to be on the edge of, that's a bit up in, it's not all thrown up in the air, but there's something interesting about, well, how both of those components remake themselves in this moment. And alongside that, how we might use other kinds of ways of thinking of the very escalated changes in the economy, which were already happening, especially in the labour market, how they fall out through the pandemic. In particular, I was thinking about what, if any, the future of small trading is in this country. So, you know, that's been such a, you know, that's already within the book, really. That's kind of small trading, which offered a foothold. You know, again, Suzi's already said it about this. You know, you learn these new skills and then you're made redundant from them again because that bit of the economy washes you away and you have to wash into the next thing. And in so many of those spaces, what has entered, of course, are varieties of the gig economy, and the gig economy mediated through different kinds of massive transnational platforms, lots of delivering, lots of Ubering, you know, so local taxing, you know, driving was already a huge part of those bits of the economy. And that shifting the street, I guess, you know, it's just a mundane thing to say, it shifts what the street is like, doesn't it? Because so much of what the small trading foothold is, well, as you say, an ability to kind of world make in a certain extent. And I think people can always world make, but you're world making a bit differently if Amazon is telling you what your rounds are from 8 in the morning till 8 at night. That's a different world is made in that process. And I guess that's kind of, you know, I'm interested in what comes in this next bit and what happens. We know that all kinds of small and not so small traders in this period have collapsed. You know, British public retail space looks very, very different, not only in city centres. It varies a bit if you travel around the country. I know people are not travelling around the country yet, but, you know, so people will have different experiences in the room. So, my family live in Leicester, and it's very, very noticeable when I visit some of them. People will know Leicester was in complete lockdown for a large part of the pandemic when other places were not. And it's very noticeable that the parts which are just permanently shut down now. Now that's not going to open up again. And some of those spaces, although they're not Narborough Road, they're similar kinds of spaces. And so there's a kind of, okay, that space of the edge economy was constituted in this kind of relational way in a certain moment. And then there's a restructuring element that comes in. And then that's kind of smashed forward by a pandemic. And now here we are all spat out. And that's not at all a question, but it is something I worry about. So if this is an opportunity to talk about it, I really hope that we can. And I've spoken for too long, sorry.
Thank you so much. That was great. Up next is Dr. Ajmal Hussein, who is assistant professor of sociology at the University of Warwick. He works on a wide range of topics, including urban and cultural sociology, Muslim vernacular culture, post-colonialism, civil society, diasporas, migration, and multiculture. Dr. Hussein is working on a book in progress titled Urban Rituals, and is the principal investigator of a study of anti-racist civil society groups in Birmingham, which is part of a broader transnational study. He also participated in the Ordinary Streets project with Suzi that supplied some of the data for this book. So please unmute yourself. The floor is yours.
Thank you, David. And congratulations to Suzi on the book. And I'll say also that I anticipated it hugely after those few moments of walking up and down Rookery Road with you and sharing coffee and some lovely Turkish platters on some of the edges of Rookery Road as well. And it's a real pleasure and honor actually to share this space with others too, whose work has really been an inspiration to me as well over the years. My reflections are probably mostly those of a resident of the city who shops occasionally in these edge territories, has friends who live and work in or near them. And in my own work, I've been interested in city making from the vantage point of different communities, often racialized and marginalized territorially, but increasingly central to concerns about the future shape of things to come for the city, not only in it. And Suzi, you do so well in revealing the street as a constellation of actors, agents, and forces that defy orderings of centrality and marginality. And you show this through movements between the spaces of the globe, the nation, and the street. Here, I want to focus on the city in this matrix, and more specifically, the city in its administrative form as a municipality, and the brokerage that goes on between territories and the center then in the name of administration. Like you show, the inconsistencies in policy, discourse, and practice maintain the contradictions at the heart of the migrants' paradox. But I wanted to sort of delve a bit deeper into some of these, following some of the conversations we had with city planners. The edges signify the limits of official municipal interventions and sensibilities of planning and development. So the business improvement district, its official remit ends at the top of Rookery Road. Other regeneration schemes didn't apply. And these edge territories then ended up having their own rationality, partly a consequence of regulation being relaxed rather than introduced. And that gives way to improvisations on behalf of migrants who regenerate these areas themselves, in the words of one senior planning officer, who also happened to come from a migrant background. And that got me thinking, is there a sort of insider know-how that these guys have, having come from similar edge territories and having witnessed the fate of these at the hands of authorities that now informs their blasé attitude towards them? Is there a deliberate recognition of the virtues of leaving these territories to their own devices? My hunch is that this sensibility is formed as a result of knowing what goes on in territories and times designated as Black, the various potentialities inherent to Black urbanisms, and specifically their operation under conditions of darkness, under which Simone tells us forms of rogue care emerge. So if we think about the ways that we witness edges being traversed, and not always by migrants, but other agents too. This might include us as researchers as we traverse the streets, not just moving between New Street, Rookery Road and the Jewellery Quarter Hotel, but also meetings with officials. We bear witness to certain oscillations that Simone talks about as generating potential to act. So these traversals keep migrants connected to the center, although not always with any effect, but with the promise that something might pull off. So I think about Poussin in the book and his valorizing of the Eritrean coffee shop. This connection buoys the proprietor and provides valuable optimism and hope, which is also an effective resource that circulates as part of the lifeblood of these territories. Just like cash is the lifeblood of any economy, the moral economy of these edge territory bleeds across them, animating contiguity as well. So what I found particularly inspiring about your work, Suzi, is how you connect it to the bigger picture, to the bigger conversations. So I'm thinking about your earlier work in Peckham and how the relative value of square meter space in those edge territories compared with Westfield Shopping Centre, for example. And you've powerfully demonstrated why such territories and enterprises should be on the purview of the authorities, and for the right reasons, because they represent incredible value in and of themselves. So here, and again, Gargi now prompts me to think about what else, what these edges, these borderings, what do they remake in terms of the new economy or the economy going forward? So in these edge territories, the bleeding across edges of racialized products and people is forced undercover. Yet there's no equality and diversity plan that might validate governmental intervention. Social inclusion is not sought for these territories into the big city plan, just like you mentioned, like it might have been a couple of decades ago as the city made multicultural a big selling point. Because it seems one conundrum here is that the dynamism of Black urban territory gets embodied and represented in the aesthetic expression, and that somehow this expression substitutes for an acknowledgement of the ways in which these Black territories continuously attempt to generate their own temporalities, their own unfolding. So here's the paradox, and in relation to the city, the lack of regeneration gives over to the market to regulate the infrastructure of the street, such as the removal of trash generated by the vast enterprises. This is handled by private concerns, which are increasingly ethnic owned and run. These are separate economies that move around spaces of the city, securing business links. Think about all the various different restaurants, etc., who rely on cheap disposal of their waste because they can't really afford what the city council's charging for them. So in that, an alternative economy is generated in and across different neighborhoods, and mainly dealing with enterprises who look for the cheapest option. So there's a flourishing of enterprises that services these streets and edge economies, but are always only viable because they might cut corners or they might offer the cheapest deal, and in turn making themselves viable. So it prompts me to think about the place of regulation, and particularly regulation from the city, when the introduction of this might have an adverse effect. That's the logic that the officials mentioned, of course. But to be viable, they operate not so much through clandestine means, but under the cover of darkness. Again, I'm invoking Simone, which further obscures and dehumanizes the edge and people within them. There is then a sort of new wave, a new site, a new scale of operation. So these just reflections which your book prompted in me. Always it prompts kind of thinking more so, and what else might come from these sort of different operations. And the edge particularly was a really, really pertinent sort of concept to work with there. So I just wanted to kind of talk about the edge at the center based on some of the sort of conversations that we had going up and down. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ajmal. There's a lot we'll be able to discuss in a bit. And We'll get even more now when we hear from Professor Engin Isin, who is professor in international politics at Queen Mary University of London. Professor Isin works on citizenship, imperialism, social movements, and politics at multiple scales and in multiple places. His many books, articles, and edited volumes include Citizens Without Frontiers and Being Political: Genealogies of Citizenship, and he's chief editor of the journal Citizenship Studies. So please unmute yourself, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and thanks for also the invitation to participate in this panel. I'm really, really pleased to be here, and I'm absolutely delighted by the Suzi's book. It's a brilliant book, and I want to say a few things about how do I locate it in both sort of in citizenship studies and urban studies and the interconnection between the two, and its, I think, original contribution in that intersection and substantively studying the city and citizenship in a different way. Suzi, when I was thinking, when I was reading your book, I was thinking, at one level, it is classical urban studies context, object, going back to Chicago school, looking at specific places, streets, and how on the streets the encounters, communication, and interaction took place amongst various people, and how that creates a certain sociability, conviviality, and so on. But that's only in appearance. I think the originality of your contribution is to study the street in a way that what you call in the book the transversal logics, how the street itself is articulated through world making, that then it signifies something more than what might one understand simply the street. Even the terminology of micro and macro, I think it just doesn't do justice to how you move in and out of the specific practices, their signifiers, and how those specific convivial practices create worlds that claim different ways of being together, you call, or negotiating difference. I think one of the highlights of the book for me is in the chapter on unheroic resistances. You specifically look at in Peckham, and you look at these or discover urban mutualisms. It's really a wonderful moment in the book because it appears really insignificant, unheroic, as you put it, these urban mutualisms. How in the face of enormous constraints from being bordered, being under surveillance, being racialized, being subjected to all sorts of both legal and other forms of domination, other forms of difficulties, challenges, how these proprietors, these street traders, actually find ways of articulating solidarity with one another in such concrete manner that it becomes a symbol of a much broader solidarity that we can imagine. You give wonderful specific examples of how a particular space is transformed in different times into serving different functions because people are in solidarity with one another. They're signifying that space in the course of a given week in these urban mutualisms. Those are just so provocative in terms of thinking about what you said, not only claiming the term migrant, but also claiming citizenship, practicing, performing it in a different way and demonstrating, as your next chapter says, a citizenship of the edge. And the edge here is not necessarily an outside, peripheral, or even marginal doesn't do really much justice to it, but edge in the sense that it really gives us a glimpse of how different it could be beyond the legal and political machineries that define citizenship in the state in a particular way as membership. Beyond that notion of membership, citizenship as practiced, performed, everyday conviviality, everyday negotiation of difference and solidarity. We see this in urban mutualism. Even the word itself goes back to the anarchist tradition of mutual aid in the 19th century and early 20th century, and yet we see it in practice in such microcosmic ways, and yet with much broader resonances. So I want to draw your attention, draw the attention of your potential and current readers of the book to a running strand, which I think is both the political innovation and the methodological innovation of the book, is to demonstrate how do we draw out really significant conclusions out of what seemingly inconclusive and insignificant practices that agents are engaged in. And you have a number of phrases, number of ways of expressing this. So I want to bring those specifically and maybe read a couple of them just to give people a sense of how you're connecting them. I will just need to find here, you're saying that, for example, in that chapter, before that chapter, giving the indication that your aim of your engagement with everyday modes of resistance is to suggest a different avenue from sociology of encounter, as I mentioned, the classical urban studies, as a mundane yet productive meeting between strangers. It's insufficient for capturing the impacts of inequality and racism that contemporary urban multiculture puts us under stress. And then you move on to urban mutualism, and you give the transversal logics of that mutualism. And then toward the end of that chapter, as the reader feels that we're zoomed in, you zoom out and you have this wonderful passage, which I'm going to read. You say, our turbulent urban century has ushered a new age of resistance in response to a new age of inequalities. But within the substantial right to the city protests, from Zuccotti Park and Paternoster Square to Taksim Gezi Park, we need to recognize that the encompassing nature of this solidarity sits alongside more fragmented and fragmenting claims to space. And later on, you say that in this sense, these unheroic struggles, these fragmented or seemingly fragmenting spaces and claims to space, these unheroic struggles of the street are about constituting space for a locally emergent politics that engages with wider claims of belonging outside of the center. And I think this is the original innovative connection you're making, that by studying these micro practices of urban mutualism, we are also teasing out the possibilities with much wider resonances. Or to put it in different words, if you really want to see how urban citizenship or citizenship in general, non-state-based alternative ways in which it's articulated and performed, we need to look at these spaces to understand their particularity and resonance. And then you say, a citizenship of the edge gives us an edge grammar that re-articulates citizenship as an adaptive and audacious constitution. And I find that really a powerful way of articulating the relationship between different scales, but not in a scalar thought, meaning that the scales are not hierarchical and linear, but actually transversal. And then I think in the penultimate moment of the book, you say, you come back to this, it's a space of encounter, that as a space of encounter, the kind of spaces that you have investigated, that they are neither politically overt or symbolically visible in the way we might think of international solidarity movements or tribunals that hold power to account. But they are just as invaluable as these are to the ongoing struggles of social and racial injustice. And I think this is really, for me, the importance of the book, that teasing out the extraordinary in the ordinary, teasing out the spectacular in the mundane, but not necessarily seeing them as binary opposites. And this is, I think, what your key category of worlding really indicates, that we often think of these binaries. If one is speaking about ordinary, therefore it must not be about extraordinary. Or if we are thinking about spectacular, therefore we must not be talking about the mundane. But the book articulates that, in fact, we can find one in the other. Edge and the center are not really opposites, but they are articulated, folded onto one another. And it is in that connection that we have to think about the specific practices and how they articulate with one another and how they resonate. And that I find really an inspiring innovation of the book, and an exciting one for both to follow through. And coming back to both comments of Ajmal and Gargi, where do we go from here also indicates that what kinds of studies now we can undertake to tease out this non-binary, non-oppositional relationship between the spectacular and the ordinary in urban lives. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. It is great to hear all these comments. There's a lot for Suzi to respond to. Do you want to respond for a bit, or should we take questions? Maybe you can respond.
Maybe I could just make a couple of points, and to thank all three of you for some incredible thoughts and offerings. So, based on the comments, maybe one place to start is to put two things side by side. And the one thing is the kind of damaging articulation that we are living with, where we are told that migration is an exceptional process, and by the same token, the migrant becomes an exceptional human category. And in the construction of that exceptionalism, there is the kind of legitimation to go ahead and punish and perform violence in all sorts of really deeply disturbing ways. Adjacent to that is what Malik Simone and others refer to as a majority world, not an exception, a majority world, who were engaged in the process of making something that we call solidarity. And I think the first vestige of solidarity is the imagination. And the beauty, to be quite romantic about it, about the imagination, is that it cannot be categorized. The imagination is an audacious prospect. And this thing of urban mutualism or of mutualism is about how we might imagine things differently together. People who are living precarious lives have to forge through with that imaginative making every day just to stay afloat. But I think we've seen in the last 2 years, with the shape-shifting nature of the pandemic, we've seen profound punishments alongside extraordinary reimaginings of what it means to come together, not least from Extinction Rebellion, from the Black Lives Matter movements. And so I think that there's a reason to be, and a requirement to be, intensely optimistic amidst the shit, basically, and to be frank. I think from this, precisely, we need to think about the age, as I try to in the book, not as a peripheral nor a minority condition, but a place to be at risk and to take risk. And so this risk taking is kind of impingent on all of us, what it means to rethink the unions, what it means to rethink local government, what it means to rethink local street associations, and the kinds of politics that we might begin to assert and remake. I'm also interested in the desperate coming together of part-time citizenship and part-time work prospects, because I think there's something going on in the invention of capitalism today which renders labor as surplus, that kind of maps onto the making of indentured forms of work with indentured forms of citizenship. So we are seeing every day in the press the unraveling of kind of very solidified notions of legal citizenship that are now becoming partialized, ephemeral, and almost floating off into the air. But I don't think that that's the process that can have the last word. I also want to come back a little bit to what Ajmal was saying about the administration of the city, and maybe to kind of reflect on a few bits of fieldwork here. It was really fascinating when we spoke to planners, whether they were working in Leicester or whether they were working in Birmingham or whether they were working in London, that they conceived of a very different conception of the local and the global. So the local was something that was almost parochial. It was articulated as a local set of resources for local communities. And the global was imagined as something out there, something that you get from Singapore or Dubai. And I think, Ajmal, that was really interesting to understand that people see a magnitude as being elsewhere. And we know from our streets, and I like to say this not because I actually want to put the street at the center of the planning project, but when we went to Birmingham and we said, you know, little old Rookery Road provides about 200 jobs, and the planners say, well, we have 77 Rookery Roads. And then we say, well, we're talking about, you know, maybe 20 to 30,000 jobs. Well, there's no system of capitalism at the moment that can provide 20 or 30,000 jobs in the poorest parts of the city. And so I think despite the terrific shifts in the pandemic, that way of making life and livelihood will endure. And I think we see its endurance in places across Africa, in Southeast Asia. We see it in this kind of constitution of a southern urbanism that understands that there is an imperative to hold on to the here and now, because that's your survival, but that's also your prospect. What were the other points that I wanted to make? But David, maybe this is the other point I wanted to make was that in these 6 years, when we were speaking to the street and we were also speaking to the state, I mean, I had a kind of terrific learning process myself, where I was initially really wanting to work with the state to try and find a vocabulary where the state might take the street seriously. And so we kind of did all of these tricks, invented a syntax, and kept visiting the state again and again with our numbers, our drawings, our diagrams, only to realize that the state never will see the street, and that our investment was much more better placed in working with activists who were thinking about the lifeblood of the street in different ways. And so here I'm really bolstered by the work of people like Patria Roman Velasquez, as well as Mafanui Taylor, who really do think about working with the street as an active resource that actually doesn't need and require the regulations of the planning system. Its lifeblood is adjacent to but outside of the center. And so, yes, in many ways, the peculiar rendition of this book is to try and think about alternative forms of citizenship, which are also about alternative forms of capitalism. So that's all for now, David. I'm happy to go back to you and also to take more questions.
No, that's great. there's so much there about precarity, about the transformation of citizenship, about the street as a political resource. I have one question from the audience that I want to pose to you, and this is from our colleague and friend Ajmal Hussein, who asks, when, if ever, does one cease to be a migrant in the context of the worlding that you're thinking about in this book?
So Aisha, I would like to say that we ought to claim that we never cease to be migrants, and that is part of our world claiming and world making, that this requirement in an uncertain world that we actively and continually learn how to be unsettled is a magnificent practice. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's about thinking about many forms of language, many forms of translation. It's thinking about shape shifting. It's thinking about how we recognize ourselves in terms of how we see one another. I really want to elevate the longevity and the resilience and the kind of crucial vitality of this term, because I don't think this term is something that should be circumscribed by a national regulation of who is and who isn't a citizen. So I think I use the word migrant, I don't use the word immigrant. I'd like to kind of think much more about migrancy and less about migration as an active world-making, world-claiming process.
Yeah, and that also, I think, speaks a bit to Gargi's earlier comment about the language of migration and the terms that we use to understand the huge set of practices that we're talking about here. I have a question just from a sort of urban studies standpoint, which is that we hear a lot from urbanists and from planners about the future of the high street. And it's often centered on all sorts of smart city schemes or sort of visions of urban space that are deeply tied into platform capitalism and a sort of digitally enabled dispossession. But I think what you're describing here really is the future of the high street that people are making for themselves. And it is both the future and the street as sort of political space, as an improvisatory space. And it, you know, it also raises questions, as Ajmal said, about regulation and how the state sort of should respond to this. I mean, I think in many ways you're describing a form of citizenship that sort of assumes permanent austerity and sort of permanent abandonment of parts of the city and of some city dwellers by the state. But I guess, I mean, how do you think the whole sort of discussion about the sort of future of the high street or the future of urban space should be transformed with this perspective trained on these practices of city making that you described here?
I mean, initially, I was really looking to the kind of the future of the high street as a serious prospect that the state could be enrolled in. And increasingly, in working over these 6 years, I think that the state articulation of the high street is incidental. It's not where we should be vesting our energies and our interests. Because I think there is this other high street that is actually, it's more ubiquitous. It's attending to people's lives in ways that are really constitutive. But having said that, we can't unthink the state from this project, because without affordable space, without affordable homes in proximities to these high streets, without the kind of regulation that requires, the high street is under significant threat. And so I think the question of reimagining rates, being much more assertive about affordable and genuinely social housing, these are infrastructures that are absolutely integral to the lifeblood of making work. You cannot make work in these environments unless you can do so and access affordable space. And I think, you know, with the looming world of the platform economy, where people are tied into these part-time and casualized contracts and they are infinitely disposable, the real question becomes, well, where are people going to find this affordable space? Where are all of these casualized, self-employed workers that we're seeing in the labor surveys? Where are they going to find the space to nurture the imaginations, to make work? And that does require some kind of political intervention. But I think, another story that came from the street quite recently was, as Ajmal knows, we returned recently to Rookery Road to try and have a little look at how things were going in COVID, in the lockdown. And in walking up and down the street, we got to one place on the street where someone had their little chair and their friend had a chair outside their shop. And the guy was running a travel agent, which of course was the worst business in the world to have in a lockdown. He basically hadn't had any custom for 18 months. And he said, the business is gone, but me and my friend come here every day to sit in the shop because this is where we have a life. And that is a story of not just making work, but making social connection, feeling like you have a foothold in the city that is still available. And I, having recently done some work with Claire Alexander in Brick Lane, which is kind of in the other end of capitalism, where the city's become so financialized, people on Brick Lane are simply being priced out of the prospect of the future of that space. And the state is kind of doing that because, the state's investing in creative capitalism and creative culture. So I don't have any faith really that the state is able to see the vitality of the street. But nonetheless, I think that there are some important threads to fight for. And one of the key threads is around affordability.
Yeah, I really like the way that this politicizes the idea of a foothold, a sort of foothold for world making, and sort of seeing that as a crucial urban infrastructure and a crucial urban sort of capacity. And I think that we could probably construct a politics around that, about the value of creating footholds for world making and some places where people are able to make their own world and not be swept away. And I think that it's a really vital contribution from this book to sort of identify and politicize this question. We have another question from Victoria, who graduated from the MSc in political sociology, and she's joining us from Weimar. And she asks, how can we as researchers make sure that we don't just extract knowledge from the people we interview and observe, but actively involve them in our research processes and findings? And I know that this is an interlinked methodological and political question that I know you've thought a lot about. So I mean, what do we owe our co-researchers and our research subjects and interviewees, and how can we involve them in shaping the knowledge production enterprise?
I mean, I don't have a clear and absolutely watertight answer to this, and in fact we were talking about it with students today. I think the first thing is to think about a process of careful listening, and that probably requires, when you're going into new places, to think about the people who are important mediators in helping you to see and to listen. And so working with people like Ajmal, when you go to Birmingham to hang out with a Brummie who takes you to the good places to eat and takes you to the back rooms that aren't always available, allows you a way of feeling and thinking the city that I think otherwise would be unavailable were you just hopping in and out, going quickly up and down on the train. So I think that thing of working with, thinking about, listening, allowing the thinking and feeling process to happen simultaneously. I think it is about countless conversations, but I also do think it is the work of translation too. So, you know, the kind of cumulative project of 6 years of doing this research is that we are able now to work with activists who are contesting really unpleasant regeneration processes. And I find it really uplifting to do that kind of work, that work of translation. So I think it's about many things: listening, translating, going back time and time again, spending a lot of time. But you know, ultimately, also we make our profession of writing stories about other people's lives, and hopefully we do that in ways that are respectful and that also then circulate into classrooms so that students might be able to see things differently too. I mean, I have a kind of incredible regard for people who do the activism as a lifeblood, people like Gargi. I would say that it's one of the several strands of research that I do, but it's not the central strand, and I can't pretend that it is. I don't know, maybe Gargi and Ajmal want to come in on this one too.
Yeah, I'd say I'd say kind of when it comes to sort of regulation, not, you know, take a leaf out of the book of these municipalities, because increasingly each time you put in an ethics application now to do research, I don't know how many of you have noticed how it gets more and more strict, to the point that it makes it very difficult to form meaningful relationships sometimes with ethnographers. And I know that, and like you say, Suzi, sometimes we have to go totally off grid. We have to go totally, you know, in times and spaces which you know, which you can't really list in an ethics application. But it is becoming very difficult to, you know, to kind of, you know, to do work out there in ordinary communities because of a lot of the sort of regulation that we have to meet. Not that we don't do that, but finding creative and imaginative ways to get around that is the first thing. But also with this project, I mean, I recall working with one particular activist who was running an organization in there, and as a result of our engagement, you know, you were able to put together another project bid, and that I think is always really amazing, because the project lent itself to that, to sort of new relationships merging and forming with people on the street. And the times I've gone back to that area, people have said, oh, I remember you were here, and what's next, etc. So people, it's you know, how do we imagine the engagement as well? Like you say, you know, I think we can imagine it a bit in much more broader ways as well. But I won't say any more in case I put my foot in it in terms of ethics. I'll leave it to Gargi.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I do research on activism. But I think what I think is that I had an idea as a younger person, and I feel like this was a way of life that was possible. It wasn't only my fantasy, that a radicalism of thought could be accommodated across a kind of patchwork life, so that you might work in a university incidentally alongside your own inhabiting of the kinds of streets you're talking about, which demanded a multiple remaking of you. And that is both the pleasure and the insistence of those kinds of spaces, because that is the space, you know, they're the spaces in which, you know, in my lifetime at least, that if you want to think about something called racial justice, that you have to be navigating the different possibilities of knowing and remaking at the same time. They're But what I think has changed is not the possibilities of the street, and everyone knows this, but the possibilities of the university. The idea that you could be sounds such an idiot, but the idea that you could be a kind of border crossing intellectual, you know, which was really kind of David to say that, and I felt embarrassed because I feel like that word has no room in the British Academy now for any one of us, least of all me, but that you could be that kind of border crossing intellectual who, yes, is engaged in research, but as only one aspect of, you know, the research is kind of incidental to your being an actor and participant in the kind of audacious and imaginative remaking of the world in streets, where new ways of life are innovated every day because they have to be. The bit has changed is the foothold in the academy. That bit seems, yeah, I feel embarrassed to see Ajmal because he's from a previous time when I got run out of work. And you feel like, oh, my whole lifetime is being, oh, next load of people run me out of work. And you think, although I need to feed my family, it's really their loss. That somehow we need to be not transfixed by the requirements and the limitations of an increasingly narrow academic life that is not alert to the key questions of what survival and mutuality might be in our time. And so Suzi's book is kind of pushing us to a different space. I know it's made in the academy. Of course, you can steal stuff from rich institutions sometimes, including little spaces to think and write. I think those little spaces are getting smaller and smaller. But I think the bigger question is how to redirect our energies and still pay the bills in a way that those strange institutional requirements of a university that seems to be dying, if it's not already dead, truly become incidental to an intellectual project that is grounded in very different sets of relations. I don't know if that makes sense. I kind of felt like it was what the book was about too.
Thanks, Gargi. And I see there's also a question from someone in the chat about connections to Asif Bayat's work on the quiet encroachment of the ordinary. And yes, I mean, I do think that in a way the whole intention is to really have a regard for the everyday, the prosaic, the incidental. But in doing that and in speaking in the street and in reading widely across the street, we also begin to realize that the street is not quiet, and it's a place that also hosts uprisings. You know, nearly all of these streets in these books were the venues for the 2011 uprisings. You know, the incredible energy that came from the Handsworth Revolution, etc. These are places close to people's homes, close to people's lives, close to people's prospects, where they feel that they have an organizational capacity to hit back and, where possible, to seek redress. And I think any of you who haven't seen the beautiful film on Mangrove should do so, because it's precisely from this very banal interior of a North London shop where we get a system that takes the law on and holds the state to account. So I think it is always about the interplay of uprising and the commonplace. I think that is the kind of essential logic of the street.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, to sort of connect this to what Ajmal and Gargi were just talking about, I mean, we live in a time when lots of footholds are being swept away in lots of different areas, and it is a kind of crisis of world making where people's capacities and spaces to form a world are being undermined and targeted and sometimes predatorily and exploited and sometimes just sort of sheer violence. And I think that there's a very powerful message here about the sort of solidarity learning that we need to do in order to be able to form a world in these conditions. And I think that there's a sort of broader message about working together with people to sort of shape a world in conditions of precarity. We have another question here, also raising a lot of big issues here, from our friend Günter Gassner, who says, given endemic forms of state and capitalist violence, and given that liberalism was and is an exclusive practice, what role do illiberal political actions and practices have on these streets that you've studied? So did you see any, did you see the sort of traces of illiberalism? I assume he's thinking about sort of the forces of reaction and the sort of neo-authoritarian turn in a lot of places. How have these been shaping the street? Also, not to use the motto of 2021, but you're muted.
It's a great question, Gunther, and it's a really complex question. I mean, there are, like all vestiges of life, there are pockets of conservatism in these streets, not least of which are how different people articulate different migrant groups that are coming in these different cycles of time. But I never saw in the 6 years of working on these streets the kind of politics of fear that is being procured through our parliamentary system today. I never saw that as a primary motive or primary means of organizing strategy and of organizing citizenship. And so I think there is something about the kind of fragments of the street, about its multifarious forms, about the way it gets created and sustained through renewed cycles and ongoing cycles of migration and change, that it makes it a very different organizational entity to the kind of parliamentary logics that are centuries old, that rely on kind of bi-party warfare, that means that people can't talk sufficiently about issues anymore because we're so fixated on talking about identities. And so the kind of illiberalism, under the guise of liberalism, I think is actually alive and well in the political establishment and not necessarily on the street.
Yeah, and that's also a really interesting point, because you do have a sort of picture of migration politics right now as sort of shaped by a lot of these projects that I think are really more national in scale in some ways and are really disconnected from the sort of life of the street. And I mean, I guess this sort of leads on to another question I had, which is that I think it's really useful to understand migrancy and the condition of migrants through an urban lens rather than a national one. I think that this when these things are debated in the national frame, it activates a lot of really troubling and problematic politics. What do you think? When we look at migrancy and migration through an urban lens rather than a national one, and when we look at the street rather than at quantitative flows, what do you think comes into focus that is otherwise obscured?
David, I don't necessarily think it's simply an optimistic lens to look through the urban, because, as Patricia Hill Collins tells us, the city is a saturated site. It's probably one of the most intense nodes for capitalism to force its way through. So we see the extremities of financialization, we see the extremities of casualization, precisely in places like cities and explicitly in the peripheries of cities. And so I think what the city allows us to see in a way is the lived realities of capitalism and sovereignty entwined. But I think it's precisely the saturation of that site and the proximity of bodies that is also the repository of something that we might call not so much hope but action. These very ordinary but also explicit and demanding forms of world making that are calling for a different mode of solidarity. It's really interesting to see the reformation of some of the trade unions taking on migrant causes. It's really interesting to see how small uprisings in streets lead to global articulations of solidarity. And so I think ultimately the city is so interesting because it is this, in a way, oversaturated site of promise, but also of punishment.
Yeah, no, what did you invoke also about these sort of different institutions forming new solidarities with migrant politics and groups trying to politicize the position of migrant and migrant labor is also a really interesting question, and this ties into another question from a member of the audience who asks how we can sort of combat the rhetoric surrounding notions of immigrant and ethnic and the sort of standard language that you hear, especially just day in, day out in the British media about migration. I mean, I think that the technical sociological term for most of what we hear is racist bullshit. And it's, thinking through the sort of disconnect between the urban worlds that you're describing, which, as you rightly say, shouldn't be romanticized. There's obviously all sorts of violence and dispossession happening there, but the disconnect between the urban worlds that you're describing and this sort of all this rhetoric about sort of the immigrants and the ethnic, what do you think? What are the sort of prospects for transforming this language politically, and how do you think that can happen? How can more of these solidarities that you just mentioned be fostered and be forged?
Wow, that's an immense question.
Well, we only have 3 minutes left, so.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that I just don't think it'll happen in parliamentary politics, and I don't think it's something that will ever be sustained in election cycles that are 4 to 5 years long, because electioneering has almost come to demand a politics of fear. It would be great to see labour movements holding politics more to account, to be able to articulate what it means to be together in terms of work prospects, in terms of the prospects of life and livelihood. It's such a big question, and we're so far down the track of the wrong path there. But I think, just in our day-to-day configurations, one of the things is to use this word migrant with a level of pride, and not to kind of accept it as a pejorative term. And to think about in our lives as teachers and researchers and activists what it means to actively enroll in the prospects and possibilities of border crossing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I mean, there's basic sort of political value and possibility for solidarity that stems also from recognizing these acts of improvisatory world making and the potential for transversal mutualism and all of the sort of very quotidian political practices that you describe in this book. I mean, I think just recognizing the role that they can play and seeing the sort of micropolitics that can emerge from them in itself surely must be part of building any solidarity. So I think we're going to have to leave it there. But on behalf of everyone who's here listening to you speak, I want to thank you so much for writing this book and for speaking to us. It's just wonderful, and I know it's going to make a big impact on multiple fields. So it's very exciting to be here for the book launch. So I also want to thank Ajmal and Gargi and Engin for coming here, and just say thank you. This is great. It's sort of odd to be an event that ends without any opportunity for anyone to give you a round of applause, but I think we're all mentally applauding you because this is wonderful. So I will give you the last word, but thank you so much.
Well, I just wanted to say, huge thanks to everyone who's hung in there for the 90 minutes, and thanks to all of you who've been on this panel. Your work has meant so much to me, and it's just been really wonderful to be in conversation with you. And I'm going off to have my glass of red wine with my colleagues down the corridor now.
Great. I look forward to forging solidarity. Thanks a lot. Then thank you all for coming and showing up, and take care.
Thank you.